One man used to be a prosperous businessman. That man once had his own store. This is a government soup kitchen giving free meals to these men who were once skilled workers in a factory, using their trained hands to produce. These people had come to depend on government relief. And where did this happen? Right here in these United States. Men called it the years of the Great Depression, the 1930s. How and why did it happen? Was it inevitable? As this chart shows, since the beginning of our American history, every period of expansion of trade has been followed by a corresponding period of contraction. This is a chart of business activity. The recurrent nature of the ups and downs is obvious. It can also be seen that these fluctuations have varied both in their length and their intensity. In the past, the economists accepted this economic seesaw as inevitable. They called it the business cycle. Now let's see how the prosperity stage of the business cycle might begin. A great many people might dip into their savings or borrow money to buy homes. The demand for houses increases suddenly. Housing contractors start building more houses to meet this increased demand. This, in turn, leads to increased demand for construction equipment, for lumber, cement, and other building materials, for home appliances and furniture, and for labor. The banks loan the money to finance this expansion of business activity. This money is used to buy the materials and the equipment and to pay wages. Now, when the workers receive this money, they usually spend most of it for food, for clothing, for housing, and for other goods and services. Now, if people start to spend money faster than goods are being produced, this may result in rising prices, which in turn encourages even more production. But now let's see how this might bring about a downturn into the recession stage of the business cycle. Let us suppose that production begins to increase faster than the demand for goods and services. Then finished goods pile up in the factories, in the warehouses, and on the store shelves. The prices are cut, orders canceled. Workers are laid off and production cut back. This means fewer people working, less money to spend. Bankers or investors hesitate to lend or invest money. This, then, is the decline or recession phase of the business cycle. If it goes on long enough and deep enough, it becomes a depression. But in 1928, America was undergoing one of the greatest booms it had ever experienced. Nearly everyone thought that these depressions were only for the history books. They were something in the past. In December 1928, President Calvin Coolidge said, "The country can regard the present with satisfaction and anticipate the future with optimism." Everyone was making money. Confidence in the American future was high. Now, this was what the picture looked like. Stock prices were going up to an unprecedented high. Production curves showed a steady increase. Everything looked rosy. But behind this apparent prosperity were some very weak spots. Now, firstly, during World War I, American farmers had supplied the world with farm products. Farmers' incomes were high. They bought land and machinery. They borrowed heavily from the banks, mortgaging their property. But with the end of the war, silos were filled with the farmers' surplus products because the European demand suddenly fell off. Now, as farm prices dropped, the farmers' income fell away, and many were unable to pay off their loans. Banks foreclosed mortgages. And farmers could no longer buy as much of the products of industry. Another soft spot in the economic picture was that a rising share of the national income was going to the small upper income group. Only 5% of the population received 1/3 of the total personal income. The stock market is often regarded as a thermometer, reading the economic health of the nation as a whole. But the market was booming. Some stocks were selling for as much as 5 times their reasonable value. In other words, they had an entirely artificial value, quite unrelated to the business they represented, because some people expected them to keep going up. Now, one reason for this was that the banks were lending out money on inadequate security. For just 10% of the purchase price, you could buy a stock, and the bank would lend you the difference, holding the stock as security. Now, this is called buying stock on a 10% margin. Now, if the value of the stock suddenly and abnormally dropped more than 10%, then your money would be wiped out and also part of the bank's security. Now, many banks at this time were allowed to support this form of speculation along with their normal business activities. Also, deposits were not insured. This meant that the life savings of millions of small depositors rested on the judgment of bank executives that stock prices would remain high. But the stock market gave a false indication of our economic health. Actually, the patient was sick, the thermometer inaccurate, the fever rose. Then in October 1929 came the crash. October 29, Black Tuesday. Stocks collapsed in 16 million share day. October 30th, stock prices nosedive. December 30th, stocks crashed 10 billions. Between 1929 and 1932, the following events occurred. The national income fell by 50%. Almost 1/2 million farmers lost their property. 15 million workers unemployed. 20 million people on public relief. 5,000 banks closed. 85,000 businesses bankrupt. 9 million life savings accounts wiped out. Can you imagine what this meant in terms of human suffering? Can you imagine what it might have meant to you? In 1932, thousands of veterans camped here in desperation and then marched on the Capitol, demanding that the bonuses owing to them be paid immediately and in cash. The whole system was so disrupted that for the first time, the government had to intervene on an unprecedented scale. President Roosevelt, in his first term, said,
"This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. We must act quickly. And finally, in our progress towards a resumption of work, we require 2 safeguards against a return of the evils of the old order. There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money. And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency."
The government did take action. The measures taken became known collectively as the New Deal. Now, its first step was to offer relief. Civilian conservation camps were established to give young men work. The Works Progress Administration was set up to provide immediate jobs for the unemployed. Government projects were started to employ people in the construction of roads, public buildings, schools, and in education and entertainment. Wages from this works program and direct relief payments to those still unemployed not only gave immediate help, but put purchasing power back into the hands of the people, thereby stimulating an increased demand for goods and encouraging recovery. Contracts were given to private contractors who were able to increase employment, purchase raw materials, purchase capital goods. Later, the New Deal developed an economic policy to safeguard the future. The stock market was put under the regulation of the Security and Exchange Commission. Corporate businesses had to make public statements so that their stocks might be more realistically estimated. To curb stock speculation, the governors of the Federal Reserve System can determine the margin requirement. Also, only sound banks were allowed to reopen. All savings deposits had to be insured by the bank with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. From now on, rates of interest were controlled, and stock purchasers had to put up most of the purchase price. The Farm Credit Administration made available to farmers loans at low interest. Legislation was passed to help the farmer by temporarily suspending his liability for mortgage payments. The most important of the farm measures was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which reduced the surplus of farm produce and guaranteed minimum prices for the farmer. The government also introduced Social Security, an insurance system to provide old age pensions to those over 65, a part of the population which in the past had had very little purchasing power. Another part of the Social Security program provided a radically new kind of insurance, an unemployment insurance which cushions the economic stress caused by widespread unemployment. America knew now that she was not alone in the world market. The government encouraged international trade and endeavored to lower tariffs, that is, import taxes, by mutual agreement. Profiting from the experiences of the Depression, Congress passed the famous Employment Act of 1946, which established a council of 3 economic advisors to the president. The aim of this law was to develop and recommend to the president national economic policies to avoid economic fluctuations or to diminish the effects thereof, and to maintain employment, production, and purchasing power. The modern industrial society is a highly complex thing. The causes of depression in one era be different from those of the next. New and unknown factors may be operating. There is no complete agreement as to the best way of dealing with the business cycle. The great majority of our people firmly believe in democratic capitalism, but they wanted to work without the insecurities of another depression like that of 1929. As no 2 recessions are exactly alike, we have to be alert to signs of new stresses, which, uncontrolled, can lead us into another depression. It is certain, however, that we have achieved some safeguards in our economy and developed a resiliency that was lacking earlier. But it may be some time before we can control our economic system and eliminate all the fluctuations of the business cycle, when there will be no more depressions.